Welcome to Learning with Mr. Ruck. I'm Mr. Ruck Dashel. Today, we are going to be learning about secession in part 3 of our part 4 series on secession. And specifically with that, we will be looking at Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address and him calling on the mystic chords of memory, the nullification crisis of Andrew Jackson's time in 1832, and comparing the east and west parts of Tennessee and how they would have to make a choice for secession. Let's history. So here's Abraham Lincoln's March 4th, 1861 inaugural address. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone over all this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely there will be by the better angels of our nature. So in other words, he's saying there that, hey, looking back to the memories that we all have of what it took to get our nation to the place it was, the patriot graves and the battlefields that we've been on, to all of the homes that we call home throughout the nation, that those will come together to support the Union when, he says, better angels of our nature are touched. In other words, better angels inside of us are neither like individual people or supernatural beings for this case. They're instead the aspects of our nature that are our better temperaments, the better ways that we act, our gentler, kinder sides of how we act, our better nature. And he's saying that they will eventually be called upon to make sure this union does not become dissolved. Now, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, there was resistance, obviously, to secession, the kind of secession that Lincoln is saying he does not want to have, and if it happens, it's because the South was the aggressor. They're resistant to secession, and they strongly identify with Andrew Jackson, and that's characterized by their intense self-determination but strong unionism. So by that it alludes to the nullification crisis of 1832, where Andrew Jackson, the president, has to get strong-armed with South Carolina. In this nullification crisis, they felt that they could nullify acts of government that came down if they did not agree with them, that the government could not force them to do something, in other words, which kind of makes you go, well, then, like, why would the government even bother to do this? Because, yeah, if they tax you or put a tariff on you in this case, which is why this happens in this 1832 crisis, then, like, what's the point of even having this larger government, this union? So South Carolina basically tries to pass this nullification law that says, hey, your tariffs you put on us, we won't pay because we don't have to. We've nullified them. And there was reasons for that to make sure that minority states didn't lose out on rights because there was a majority that overruled them. But the union led by Andrew Jackson was basically like, yeah, that's not going to happen because then why would anyone pay tariffs and taxes? So he basically shot that down, and South Carolina at the time was like, well, then we'll just secede if that's what you're going to do, and thought that the South would join with them. But of course they didn't, since this is in 1832. And Andrew Jackson is like, okay, well, we'll have some sort of compromise. He decreases the tariffs, but still holds them in place, and they get along from there. So at the time, Tennesseans were far less divided, though, on the question of the Union than they were on the question of slavery. Many pro-slavery Tennesseans were actually reluctant to leave the Union because of what Lincoln referred to as mystic chords of memory, like I explained. In the election of 1860, John Bell carried that state, being from Tennessee, and makes that kind of appeal as noted in Lincoln's first inaugural address. In fact, if not for Tennessee Governor Isham Harris, Tennessee may not have actually seceded at all. So it's kind of in large part because of the governor manipulating the state's way of things at the time. Now, most citizens of East Tennessee were intensely loyal to the Union. Many had followed the Union flag to Mexico, and some had fought under it against the Indians at Horseshoe Bend. All were proud of their grandfathers in fighting the British and Indians during the Revolution. Most men were members of the Democratic political party and proud that they had helped put Andrew Jackson, one of their own, in the White House. They shared Jackson's respect for a strong central government and were pleased at its harsh treatment of South Carolina's attempts at that nullification crisis in the name of states' rights. They also had used pokeberries to dye the manes and tails of the horses red to show support for James Polk in his race for presidency. The opening wedge, though, came between the people of the Valley was the fact that while most were proud to be loyal to the country represented by the old Union, some began to long for greater freedom promised by a new country. The name of wedge was Secession in this case. So, small farms in East Tennessee produced little cash, and farmers were working really hard to make ends meet. And there was general dislike for the wealthy plantation owners in the West, and the East Tennesseans did not want the Union to dissolve or go to war to defend slavery, which was making the West rich and them not profiting from it. The view was really that the issue of slavery was a problem for the plantation owners to solve, and it didn't affect them. That is not to say everyone held the same views, though. The Chattanooga Advertiser, a newspaper at the time, in an editorial of December 22nd, 1859, wrote, "All of us hold and all of us desire, as far as practical, to become commercially independent of the North." Therefore, the views varied and had much to do with one's self-interest and personal circumstances. Nevertheless, the thought of being pro-Union was a strong force and eventually divided the community as the war got underway. It's a tricky thing. In the East, they're like, all of you people in the West with your conglomerate plantations are making life difficult for us farmers. However, we believe in our state, so I guess we'll secede, even though we don't really support slavery, and we wish that we were as successful as the plantation owners. Tough choices across the board. Secession was truly ripping the nation apart, and even those who professed support for slavery, like the state of Tennessee, in their seceding, and therefore supporting slavery, were really not so cut and dry, not so clear as far as what they actually would choose, because there was a real voice in the East that did not support slavery. All right, this has been Learning with Mr. Ruck, and I hope you enjoyed something out of this, got a little bit of extra knowledge, because this issue of slavery and secession is super important in this time of our country and where we're at today. We'll see you next time. Peace.